Good morning, everyone. My topic for today's presentation is operant conditioning, and my moderator is Dr. Veena ma'am. This is an overview of all of the topics that we will be going through today. First, there will be an introduction. Then we will talk about reinforcement, punishment, shaping and training, schedules of reinforcement, and application. Now, operant conditioning, this is learning which is based on consequences. That is a form of learning in which behavior is maintained or changed through consequences. Now, in situations which involve operant conditioning, the probability that a given response will occur changes depending on the consequences that follow it. Psychologists generally agree that these probabilities are determined through 4 basic procedures, 2 of which strengthen or increase the rate of behavior, and 2 of which weaken or decrease the rate of behavior. Now, procedures that strengthen the behavior are termed as reinforcement, whereas those that suppress behavior are termed as punishment. Now, reinforcement. Now, in reinforcement, there is application or removal of a stimulus so as to increase the strength of a specific behavior. There are 2 types of reinforcements. There is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement, it involves the impact of positive reinforcers, that is stimulus events or consequences that strengthen the responses that precede them. In other words, if a consequence of some action increases the probability that the action will occur again in the future, that consequence is functioning as a positive reinforcer. Some positive reinforcers seem to exert these effects because they are related to basic biological needs. Such primary reinforcers include food when we are hungry, water when we are thirsty, and sexual pleasure. In contrast, other events acquire the capacity to act as positive reinforcers through association with primary reinforcers. Such conditioned reinforcers include money, status, grades, trophies, and praise from others. Now, preferred activities, they can also be used to reinforce behavior. That is, this is a principle which is referred to as Premack principle. And the definition of Premack principle is the principle that a more preferred activity can be used to reinforce a less preferred activity. For example, if the parents say that you must clean your room before you watch TV, or you must eat your vegetables before you eat dessert. In this, a more preferred activity, that is eating dessert, is used to reinforce a less preferred activity, that is eating vegetables. Now, negative reinforcement, this involves the impact of negative reinforcers. This is the stimuli that strengthen responses that permit an organism to avoid or escape from their presence. Thus, when we perform an action that allows us to escape from a negative reinforcer that is already present, or to avoid the threatened application of one, our tendency to perform this action in the future increases. Some negative reinforcers, such as intense heat, extreme cold, or electric shock, exert their effects the first time that they are encountered, whereas others acquire their impact through repeated association. Now, for example, now on a particularly cold and dark winter morning, you're sleeping soundly in a warm, comfortable bed. Suddenly, the alarm clock across the room begins to ring. Getting out of the cozy bed is the last thing you want to do, but you find the noise intolerable. So what do? If you get up to turn off the alarm, or on subsequent mornings, get up early to avoid hearing the sound of the alarm altogether, your behavior has been negatively reinforced. In other words, your tendency to perform actions that allow you to escape from or avoid the sound of the alarm clock has increased. Next, we will talk about punishment. Now, in contrast to reinforcement, punishment aims to weaken or decrease the rate of behavior. Punishment is the application or removal of a stimulus so as to decrease the strength of behavior. Now, as with reinforcement, There are two types of punishments. There is positive punishment and negative punishment. Now, in positive punishment, behaviors are followed by aversive stimulus events termed punishers. Now, contrary to what common sense seems to suggest, punishment is not the same as negative reinforcement. As in negative punishment, the rate of a behavior is weakened or decreased by the aversiveness of loss of potential reinforcements. For example, a person is speeding and is caught by the police. Now, if the person, he pays a fine, that is a punishment. That is an unpleasant outcome, so that the chances of the same occurring of the person speeding in the future will decrease. While if the patient, he receives the choice that he should take a month-long driver's education class or he will lose his license. And the person, he chooses a month-long driver's education class. This is negative reinforcement, which the person did to avoid an aversive event, that is the loss of his driver's license. Now, this is a table which is an overview of reinforcement and punishment. Now, positive reinforcement. Now, this is an application of a desirable stimulus, which strengthens responses that precede the occurrence of stimulus. Now, the organisms in this, they learn to perform responses that produce positive reinforcers. In negative reinforcement, there is removal or postponement of an undesirable stimulus, that is heat, cold, or harsh criticism. Now, this will strengthen response that permit escape from or avoidance of stimulus. Now, in this, the organisms, they learn to perform responses that permit them to avoid or escape from the negative reinforcers. In positive punishment, there is application of an undesirable stimulus, which weakens response that precede the occurrence of stimulus, and the organisms, they learn to suppress responses that lead to unpleasant consequences. In negative punishment, there is loss or postponement of a desirable stimulus, which weakens responses that lead to loss or postponement of reinforcement. And the organisms, they learn to suppress responses that lead to loss or postponement of reinforcement. Now, next we will talk about shaping and chaining. Now, in shaping, this is a technique in which closer and closer approximations of desired behavior are required for the delivery of positive reinforcement. Now, in this, the person, he will receive a reward for each small step towards the final goal. So, initially, the actions which even remotely resemble the target behavior, they will receive a positive response. This is called as successive approximations. Now, later, closer and closer approximations are required for the reward will be given. For example, a baby, he just blurts more, and the parents, they become very happy. They give him a lot of attention and affection. But over time, the parents, they will only shower affection and attention on the baby when he will produce sounds that approximate actual words. Now, next is chaining. Now, chaining is a procedure that establishes a sequence of responses which lead to a reward following the final response in the chain. Now, usually shaping and chaining, initially shaping is used and later there is chaining to to give a reward. For example, there is a beginner student. So the dance teacher will initially use shaping to establish the basic skills. So she will praise basic accomplishments of the student, but later the student, she will only receive praise when she will complete the entire sequence. This is chain. Now, there is a term which is called as instinctive drift, which is a tendency to return to the type of behavior that a person would show under natural conditions. Now, an experiment was performed by Keller and Marion in 1961, where they trained animals to perform unusual tricks using standard shaping techniques. Like pigs, they used to deposit silver dollars into a piggy bank. Initially, the pigs they were able to do it, but gradually, after some time, they noticed that the pigs they threw coins on the ground instead of making deposit in the bank. That is, they returned to the same type of behavior that they would show under natural conditions. Now, operant conditioning usually proceeds faster as the magnitude of reward that follows each response increases. But the effectiveness of rewards can be dramatically affected by reward delay. That is the amount of time that elapses before the reward is delivered. In general, longer delays produce poorer levels of performance. For example, children will often choose smaller, immediate rewards over rewards of greater value that they must wait to receive, a tendency which is sometimes referred to as impulsiveness. In a typical study of reward delay, people were given a choice between a smaller reward that is available immediately and a larger reward whose delivery is postponed for some time. Now, but if the wait of the larger reward was lengthy, it was understandable why the person might instead choose the smaller but sooner alternative. However, if the time frame was shifted so that the smaller reward is still available before the larger one, but access to both rewards is relatively far off in the future, people generally choose the larger alternative. In other words, when both reward options are relatively distant events, people tend to be more rational in their decisions. Now, in now we talk about the schedules of reinforcement. The simplest is called the continuous reinforcement schedule, in which every occurrence of a particular behavior is reinforced. For example, if a rat receives a food pellet each time it presses a lever, or a small child receives 25 cents each time he ties his shoes correctly, both are on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Other types of schedule, however, termed partial or intermittent reinforcement, are often more powerful in maintaining behavior. Now, in fixed interval schedule, the occurrence of reinforcement, it depends on the passage of time. The first response made after a specific period has elapsed brings the reward. When placed on schedules of this type, people generally show a pattern in which they respond at low rates immediately after the delivery of a reinforcement, but then gradually they respond more and more as the time when the next reward can be obtained approaches. A good example of behavior on a fixed interval schedule is provided by students studying. For example, the students, they study very less after they give a big test or an exam, but their studying, it will increase dramatically as the next big test will approach. Now, in variable interval schedule, the period that must elapse before a response will again yield reinforcement varies around some average value. A good example of behavior on a variable interval schedule of reinforcement is provided by employees whose supervisor checks their work at irregular intervals. Now, since employees, they never know when such checks will occur, they must perform in a consistent manner in order to obtain positive outcomes, such as praise, or avoid negative ones, such as criticism. Now, next is a fixed ratio schedule. Now, in this, the reinforcement will occur only after a fixed number of responses. Now, individuals who are paid on a piecework basis, in which a fixed amount is paid for each item produced, they are operating according to a fixed ratio schedule. Now, generally, such schedules yield a high rate of response, though with a tendency towards a brief pause immediately after each reinforcement. And the pauses, they occur usually because the individuals take a slight breather after earning each unit of reinforcement. Now, finally, on a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement, it will occur after completion of a variable number of responses. Since organisms confronted with a variable ratio schedule cannot predict how many responses are required before reinforcement will occur, they usually respond at high and steady rates. The effect of such schedules on human behavior is readily apparent in gambling casinos, where high rates of responding occur in front of slot machines and other games of chance. And variable ratio schedules, they also result in behaviors that are highly resistant to extinction, ones that persist even when the reinforcement is no longer available. Now, this phenomena is also called as partial reinforcement effect, and it seems to occur for the following reason. Now, because the reinforcement has been infrequent and intermittent in its delivery, people or other organisms, they may continue to respond after all reinforcement has ended, because it is difficult for them to recognize that the reinforcement is no longer available. Under a variable ratio schedule, many responses are not followed by reinforcement. For example, many golfers, they are well acquainted with the partial reinforcement effect. For each great shot they hit many more poor ones, yet they still continue to play the game. Now, next is concurrent schedules of reinforcement. Now this is a situation in which behaviors having two or more different reinforcement schedules, they are simultaneously available, and this type of schedule has been used to study choice behavior in animals and humans. For example, on a given evening, a student has a choice that she can study or other behaviors like watching TV or going out with friends or cleaning her room. Now, next is matching law. Now, in a typical animal experiment, which involved a concurrent schedule of reinforcement, a rat was free to press lever A or lever B at any time, or to press neither. Furthermore, the rat could distribute its presses between the two levers as it chose. Now, suppose the consequence of pressing each lever, that is food reward, was arranged according to distinct variable interval schedules of reinforcement. Now, the rate of responding on each lever would tend to match the rate of reinforcement each lever produces. Now, in other words, the rat would distribute its behavior between alternatives in such a way that will maximize the reinforcement it receives for its efforts. Now, this phenomena has been termed as matching law. Now, this is a chart which shows the fixed interval schedule and the variable interval schedule, fixed ratio schedule, and variable ratio schedule. Now, fixed ratio schedule, as we can see, the studying by students, it increases before an exam. And then when the exam finishes, it decreases again and again increases as the next exam will come. In variable interval schedule, the work output by employees whose manager was checking their work at irregular intervals, there was a constant rate of responding. In fixed ratio schedule, where the work output was in a piece rate reward system, after each work is completed, we can see a very brief pause. And in variable ratio schedule, we can take an example of gambling behavior, and we can see that there is a constant high rate of gambling. Next thing we talk about is a discriminative stimulus. Now, this is a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement if a specific response is made. And stimulus control, that is consistent occurrence of a behavior in the presence of a discriminative stimulus. For example, if there was a rat and initially, whenever he used to press a lever, he used to get a food pellet. Now, after some time, he noticed that there was a presence of a light. And whenever the light was on, then only when he pressed the lever, the food pellet would come. So the rat, he started to press the lever only in the presence of light to receive food to receive food pellet. That is, the light was the stimulus that signaled the availability of reinforcement. That is the food pellet. And the stimulus control. This is the behavior of the rat. That is, the rat, he obeyed the light signal, that is which decided whether the lever pressing should be performed or not. Next thing is learned helplessness. This is the lasting effects which are produced by exposure to situations in which nothing an organism does works. That is, no response yields reinforcement or provides escape from negative events. Now, for example, many children which are living in slums, they perceive that they have little control over their environment and they have very less hope of escaping it. So they resign themselves to that life. And usually, now, if the situation changes so that some responses will work, organisms which are in a state of learned helplessness, they never discover this fact. And the research on learned helplessness, it seems to suggest that its onset stems partly from our perceptions of control. That is, when we begin to believe that we have no control over our environment or our lives, we stop trying to improve our situations. Next, we talk about the contrast effect. Now, studies have shown that shifts in the amount of reward we receive. Now, that can dramatically influence performance. A temporary behavior shift termed the contrast effect. For example, when laboratory animals they are shifted from a smaller reward to a larger reward, there is an increase in their performance to a level higher than that of subjects which were consistently receiving the larger reward. This increase is known as a positive contrast effect. Now, conversely, when subjects they are shifted from a larger reward to a smaller reward, the performance decreases to a level lower than that of subjects receiving only the smaller reward, which is a negative contrast effect. Both positive and negative contrast effects, they are transient. For example, if a person he receives an unexpected raise in his salary, his performance will skyrocket for some time, but later it will fall to the same level as the people who were already receiving the same amount of salary. Now we talk about Tolman's cognitive map, which was a classic study in the history of psychology. In this, rats they were trained to run in a very complicated maze, and in the end, there were three groups. There was a reward group, a no reward group, and a no reward or reward group. Now, a reward group they received food reward in the gold box at the end of maze on each day of their um, of their trials. The no reward group did not receive any food pellets, and the no reward group they did not receive any reward till the 11th day of their training. Now, in the reward group, this is the average number of errors which were performed, and this is the number of days. This is an average number of errors which were performed, and these are the number of days which passed. In the reward group, the the number of errors they decreased rapidly for subjects which were receiving the reward, while in the ones which had no reward, the number of errors they decreased very slowly. And in the ones which had no reward or reward group, the number of errors they decreased very dramatically after the 11th day. Now we come to the applications. Yes, so there were three groups in which the rats they were divided into, and finally they had to complete a maze. Now the rats which were in the reward group, they used to receive a food pellet every time they completed the maze. The no reward group, they did not receive any food pellet, and the no reward or reward group, they did not receive any food pellet until the 11th day. After the 11th day, once they completed the maze, they again they received a food pellet. So now, because now first we will talk about the reward group. Now the number of errors which were performed by the rats in the reward group, they decreased rapidly, while the errors which were formed by the mice in the no reward group, they decreased very slowly, while in the no reward group till the 11th day, they also the errors they were decreasing very slowly, but after the 11th day, when they saw that they were receiving a food pellet, the errors they decreased very dramatically. Now, this now Tolman, he said that the animals, they learned something during the previous trials, even though they received no reward. He termed this a cognitive map, that is a mental representation of the environment. The applications of operant conditioning, one of the most impressive operant-based teaching techniques, they involve the use of computers in the classroom, which are often termed as computer-assisted instruction or CAI. In this, the students, they interact with sophisticated computer programs that provide immediate reinforcement of correct responses. Now, with certain restrictions, these programs, they can also be paced according to each student's progress. Now, a second area of application is biofeedback, which is a technique in which sophisticated equipment allows people to monitor and then alter bodily responses not usually susceptible to voluntary control, such as skin temperature, muscle tension, blood pressure, and electrical activity of the brain. For example, with biofeedback equipment, ongoing increase or decrease in muscle tension, they are reflected by concomitant changes in a light or tone. Now, then a patient who is undergoing biofeedback monitors this information and uses it to alter muscular tension. Now, biofeedback has been successfully used to treat a broad range of ailments, including headaches, high blood pressure, muscle tics and chronic lower back pain, and depression and alcohol. Now, techniques of operant conditioning, they've also been applied to many issues and problems in work settings. For example, to improve the performance of employees and in the development of flexible work schedules. Now, principles of operant conditioning, they've also been applied in interventions for solving socially significant issues in our communities, such as crime, energy conservation and recycling, healthcare issues, consumer affairs, and safety promotion. Now, operant conditioning, it can also be used to modify child behavior. This is divided into three parts. First, there is a behavioral interview in which there is a functional analysis of the problem behaviors which the child is displaying. And then second is the observation by parents. They record the baseline data. Then they see what are the problem behaviors and the incompatible desirable behaviors. And finally, the application of consequences come in which the parents, they give a positive reinforcement for desired behaviors, and there is a proper sequence for obtaining compliance. That is command, warning, and consequence, even if the parents, they are to punish the child. Last.
Okay, I think Dr. Veena was getting shared to go. It's a very interesting topic because we have to, in each slide, we can talk about. So there is that anybody who doesn't get a reward or doesn't get any response after some time, all time. Okay. The decrease you see in the purple line is initially more, that in the decrease, even more reward. More reward, people are not expecting any. Okay? They are doing, but still they are learning. They are doing good. Now the other one reward, they are expecting a reward. The reward के साथ साथ कभी कभी बात में वो reward भी use to it. Till then, all was also greater than the reward. more reward वाले सीखते उसके बाद जो इंटरमीडिएट को पहले कर उनका उनका more reward का साथ तो reward में काम के लिए बहुत सीखते तो ये जब अपना भी समाज में और वो काम करते हैं बच्चों को बहुत reward ठीक है इंटरमीडिएट होता है और अगर आप कुछ तो कभी आपको मान लो